Hello everyone, welcome to this RTS Journalism Masterclass. I understand quite a lot of you are journalists or want to be journalists, so I'm hoping that Rohit and I can guide you through our experience of journalism. So I'm Tazeen Ahmed and this is Rohit Kachroo, who I'm very, very excited to be speaking to today. The format's going to be that I'm going to interview him, we're going to sort of tell the story of his career, sort of speed through it for the next hour and play you some clips. And then hopefully we'll get some questions from you guys too. So just keep thinking about the kinds of things you might want to ask Rohit about. So some very quick introductions. I've been a television journalist since 1995. And during that time I've worked for ITN, NBC News, which is an American network, and also for the BBC and Channel 4. I've been a news reporter and anchor. I was doing that at the BBC for about 10 years. And then I became a foreign correspondent at NBC News and sort of simultaneously and quite madly started working for Dispatches on Channel 4 as an investigative reporter, and I've been doing that for about 8 or 9 years. And Rohit, who we're here to talk about, is now security editor of ITV News, doing what is probably what I think one of the most interesting and exciting beats of modern times. He's also a former RTS Young Journalist of the Year. He was the Africa correspondent for ITV2 and has covered and continues to cover some of the world's trickiest stories. He's carried out some groundbreaking interviews and has broken some very important stories. Please do welcome him. So Rohit, just before we start talking about your amazing career, can you just start by just telling the audience, I described it as a very exciting job, but what exactly is a security editor?
Well, actually at ITV News, it's a brand new job. It was a job that was actually created 12 months ago, but in fact, exactly 12 months ago, almost to the day. And the reason for that was, well, there were two things. 1 year ago, we'd all just had a horrendous weekend of reporting the attacks in Paris. And I think one realization for our newsroom, for our management, was that actually the story of security and counter-terrorism really needed somebody to put their entire attention into this. Previously, I'd been what was called a UK editor, which was essentially a home affairs editor. And we covered security as a national issue. You know, it was a legacy from the days of the IRA, where it was the Home Office that really led on stories about counter-terrorism. And what Paris made absolutely clear, and what events have made even clearer since, is that this is a story that crosses borders, it crosses boundaries. And so that job was created there and then. And there was another thing that was happening, which was the direction of travel, not only of our organisation, but I think of most TV newsrooms too, which was the move towards specialism. You know, when I started as a TV correspondent, the most important thing was that you write a script well, that you can tell a story. And that's still incredibly important. And I think it's particularly important at our place because we are in the business of bulletins rather than rolling news. But I think on top of that, there has been a big move to have correspondents who have some level of expertise in a very small area of the news spectrum.
And I do remember that when I started, one of the things I was told quite early on was develop a specialism. That was 20 years ago, but it seems like it's still relevant now. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what your path to journalism was, because I think there are multiple paths, and I know that your path and my path were very different. How did you start?
Well, I was keen to be a journalist from, school, being a school kid actually, pretty much day one. And I went to study political science at university. I'd asked around, I'd written to a load of newsrooms, to a load of TV companies, and very, very few people got back to me. But one of the people who did, and I'd written all over the country, I'm from Birmingham, was Central News, my local ITV newsroom, just down the road in Birmingham, who wrote back saying, okay, CV's interesting. What you need to do now, though, is do something that isn't journalism. And, I think that was advice that was a bit more popular then than it is now. So I went and did political science, but through it all, I was going into that newsroom at the weekend, being paid £40, I think, to go in and make some calls make some coffees. Eventually they were saying, they were so short-staffed that they say, can you just pop out and do an interview? Eventually it would be, can you just pop out and do a report? And so when I left university, I then went to Cardiff as part of the ITV traineeship and did a postgraduate there. And I began in that same newsroom as a trainee producer.
And you still sort of felt that I need to go and do this postgraduate, because I was actually, my beginning was also very similar, but I chose not to go down the postgraduate route and went straight in and just kept doing more and more of the reporting until I sort of felt that actually this is what I am now, I'm a reporter.
Yeah.
But you felt you needed to get that credibility.
I felt that at the time, yeah. And what's interesting is looking back at it. At the time, you feel that there is only one route. I need to find the right route. But, when you talk to your peers a few years later, what you realise is that there are a million routes into it. And it's one of the joys of our industry is that there are so many ways into it. And frankly, enthusiasm and good ideas and commitment and passion for stories are all much more important than whether you did a postgraduate diploma at City University or whether you did a traineeship at, Channel 4 or whatever.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's the stories that you break.
100%.
And let's just talk about your first, what was that story where you thought, actually, I've finally broken through? Because I think there are lots of stories that we all tell and go, that's my breakthrough. And in fact, if you look over your career, you can go, actually, that was another breakthrough story, or that story took me to the next level. What do you think was your first breakthrough
Well,
story?
I mean, I've never really thought in hugely grand terms. So I've never thought, well, I want to be, I knew that I eventually wanted to be a foreign correspondent because I always thought it looked fairly cool. You could just be out in interesting places telling quite wacky stories. But that wasn't at the back of my head. And I guess, one of my early jobs was as Midlands correspondent for ITV News. And I'd been working in the local newsroom, trying to get into the network newsroom. And I sort of thought, well, the way to do this is to be the expert in my patch and try and sell myself to the network newsroom as the person who can look after the Midlands. And I mean, it was a really, really busy news time. MG Rover had just closed down. There was this, maybe people will remember it, a case of these two girls who were shot dead at a New Year's party in Birmingham, which really opened the debate about gun crime. This was maybe 10 years ago. And these constant cases of social workers, kids who were in the care of social services, who were having terrible things happen to them. And actually one of them was a story of Kyra Ishak, who was I think a 7-year-old girl who was killed by her mother and her stepfather, and who was in the care of social services. And I took a real interest in that case because I thought, yes, it's a really, really important story. But also, it's a story that unless you sort of, to use a cliche, get under the skin of it, you can't really understand it.
Okay, well, let's take a look at a clip from it.
For all its many pages of analysis, of recommendations, the report's conclusions are clear. The death of the child was preventable, it says. School staff's concerns communicated on several occasions to social services were not properly heard. The response fell short of an acceptable standard and clearly was a missed opportunity. Kyra starved to death, but she could have been saved had social workers not lost sight of her case, had they not been so intimidated by her mother. In early 2007, Kyra's mother wrote to the school stating that the children in her care should be given one dinner and no seconds. By December, teachers were very concerned. This referral, obtained by ITV News, shows their worry that she was stealing food. She was very slender, it said. That same month, she was taken out of school to be home educated, in spite of a perfect attendance record. In early 2008, the school nurse and teacher reported another child in Angela's care as losing weight. Child protection workers were still treating this as an attendance problem, not a welfare issue, despite all the evidence, even by the time of their final fleeting visit to Kyra's home. Social workers came here to the doorstep and saw Kyra 12 weeks before she died. And yet they didn't actually come into the home. They never saw Kyra on her own. All the while she was being fed
tiny portions of food here on the floor of the living room, and yet the kitchen was filled with food.
Today we were told that 3 members of social care staff involved in the case had been removed from frontline duties, but no managers have been fired.
The idea that the immediate response to any difficulty that arises, and particularly to a tragedy, is somebody either gets sacked or has to resign, I'm afraid I don't accept.
But there are almost 200 pages of absolute failure here, and yet you, the man in charge, is still here.
I have discussed my future. As it happens, I am retiring in January.
Still here, though.
Still here, and the view is that this does not require my resignation.
If this didn't, what would?
I think that if there was a serious lack of confidence from the City Council, then I would probably reconsider that position.
Kyra Ishak's name now covers countless weighty reports, as well as a sparse patch of the Birmingham cemetery. We're yet to see whether this report might end those particular failings, or if it's another document filled merely with intentions. Rohit Kachroo, ITV News, Birmingham.
Do you know, Rohit, one of the things I noticed when I was looking, I know it's fantastic. One of the things I noticed when I was looking through your work was just how many times you selected stories that had real heart, and how invested you must have been in that. And it made me think about the fact that you won RTS Young Journalist, which is a fantastic accolade. I've won a few awards, but I often now sit on juries, and I'm often telling friends of mine who've been nominated but have lost that awards don't matter. Maybe I'm lying, but I wondered what your experience is. Do you feel that awards really do matter? Do they make a real difference to your career?
I think it changes organisation to organisation. I think we culturally at ITV News put a lot on awards. I've been to RTS Journalism Award nights where we won nothing or next to nothing. And although everyone's saying, this doesn't really matter, like the mood in the taxi back to ITN tells you that actually they do matter. I think they matter when you win, they don't matter when you lose. I mean, in reality, of course, it's nice to have recognition for stories that you've put a lot of effort into, that you've worked hard on. And I think for those organisations that aren't the BBC, I suspect there is an added sense of a need to be recognised sort of within the industry. And so, they're not the be-all and end-all, of course, but I mean, I think they do matter. They particularly matter when you win one.
Yeah, and also I think just being nominated is really rather important.
Sure.
Can we now talk about some of the most important foreign reporting you did? You went to Afghanistan, I've been too, and you picked, you covered a story there that I was really moved by. We were talking about this backstage. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think what this story illustrates is something that we probably don't do in television news enough. We're very much on the day, and we all accept that our stories are just, really a bunch of words that hang around characters. That in television we have that unique advantage over other forms, other medium, sound and pictures, and to convey the characters of the people involved. And this story I picked out because I think it's an example of what you can do when you follow people beyond the shoot. So often we are only interested in someone for that half an hour duration that we're actually filming with them. We say, yeah, thanks very much, we shake hands and we leave. And this is a story of someone I met in Afghanistan who'd been incredibly helpful to us. The Ministry of Defence didn't want us to do some things, and he ensured that we got the shots we wanted. And this was, when British troops were still there, but also it was at a time when many British troops were coming home very badly injured. And so we were constantly trying to tell this story. And here was an example of someone who we could follow through. That's the phrase that's often used in our newsroom. You feature them once, and it's an interesting story. But the next time you go back to them and you can tell their story from your day one, that story has so much more impact and so much more power. And this was one way that we were able to tell the story of injured British servicemen who were coming back.
Okay, can we take a look at that?
Vehicle's going to push up onto this corner here, and these two push slightly further down. Okay, so I'll direct you exactly where to go, yeah?
The commander leading his platoon through the Helmand Desert is Lieutenant Garth Banks.
Could you ask him which...
Before Christmas, I joined him as they searched for Taliban north of Lashkar.
It's 24/7, and yeah, we keep going, find out more about the community, more about sort of important bits of information in and around Lashkar.
But there were only 2 weeks left of Garth's time on the front line. This is him today, and here is his new battlefield. His body and his life reshaped by war when he stepped onto an improvised bomb in a Taliban compound.
It's quite a difficult one to picture. It's a sort of see yourself in the future in the state I am. So no, I didn't really sort of consider it obviously I saw it as a possibility, but I never really saw it, you know, as anything that would become a reality.
He's being treated at the Rehabilitation Centre for Injured Service Personnel, Headley Court in Surrey, and he's one of the first to use their new pool, paid in part by Help for Heroes and designed for those who've lost limbs.
Okay, so he thinks sort of this entire area from Chanjir up there down to Lashkar, he calls this Basharan.
I think that's probably the thing I miss most and will miss most is that, you know, exciting job that's being an officer in the infantry.
Do you feel like precisely the same person that we met in December?
I don't feel any different, certainly. Just a bit shorter.
Yeah. His prosthetic limbs are now being altered for his new challenge to walk again. At Headley Court, that is a goal shared by many. That might provide moments of comfort. It also shows the impact of war and the courage of so many of the injured. Rohit Kachroo, ITV News, Surrey.
I was saying to Rohit backstage that I really loved how he told this story, and as someone who's worked in TV for about 20 years, I'm constantly re-editing anything I watch. And also because I work in investigations where I have the luxury of telling a story over 30 or 50 or 60 minutes, you know, I often think you can't tell a powerful story in a couple of minutes or 3 minutes, but I really think you did there. There are some stories that really stayed with you, and often do stay with you, you know, throughout your journalistic career. What did Garth's story mean to you?
Well, I mean, it meant a lot because, you know, you're so, even as a journalist, even the most frontline correspondent actually is seeing the world through a bit of a prism. You know, you're reading it in newspapers, you're seeing it on TV. And that year we had heard so much about the apparent scandals of British servicemen and servicewomen in Afghanistan, you know, about their equipment, about the huge loss of life, which seemed to be growing almost every day. It seemed that there was news of another British serviceman, servicewoman who had been killed in Afghanistan. And actually, you know, what his story meant to me was that, you know, it put a face on it. But actually, you know, he enabled us to tell the story long term. You know, we still emailed. I mean, he's done all sorts of stuff since. He's been in a Hollywood movie as an extra. With Tom Cruise, you know, he tried to play tennis for Britain at the Paralympics, and you know, and actually, I guess what it reminds you is that, you know, although I talk about expertise and specialism, you know, the building blocks of our journalism, of TV journalism, you know, are people and, you know, powerful human stories like that one.
Yeah. So your next big move was to Africa. Tell me about how that happened.
So I had moved down to London as the crime correspondent in summer of 2010. And that was the year of the World Cup in South Africa. And I was sent over as part of a big ITV News team. And I think part of the thinking was, well, as a crime correspondent, you know, and this was one of the huge misconceptions before that story, was that the thinking that that crime would be a big part of that story. And so I went over as the crime correspondent, and I mean, there was not a single story on any British television news programme about crime, unless it was sort of scaremongering. And so I went over there and had a great time. And I remember saying to my boss when I got back, you know, oh, do you know what? It was brilliant. I could actually live there. And he remembered that. And we had recently rested our bureau there. And they reopened it jointly with NBC, our partner. And they said, look, we want a correspondent to go there. And so they asked me, and I was kind of thrilled, hugely daunted. And so I went the following year in January 2011.
And then you covered Mandela's funeral.
Yeah, I mean, and actually this was, you know, I was told the day I went there that of all the things you do, the one thing you have to do when you're there is be there to cover that story. You can't be in you know, the bush in Cameroon if Nelson Mandela passes away in Johannesburg. And it was one of, you know, a small number of planned stories, huge, you know, there's a huge plan that sat on a computer. And I remember reading it and thinking, wow, I had no idea that we had plans for any story like this. And so, you know, I was constantly cancelling social arrangements because of all holidays, because of a rumour about Nelson Mandela's death, his passing away. And, you know, we had shelves full of obituaries and guests who were lined up, you know, which sounds like a sort of morbid practice to outsiders.
It's a cynical, terrible way that news works.
It is, but it's to do justice to the story and to the person, it does require a large amount of planning. And, you know, and so my first couple of years there, Nelson Mandela went to hospital several times, and I remember constantly phoning up, you know, relatives and friends who were coming over saying, oh, sorry, is there any chance you could delay a week? And then I remember that night clearly, it was just before Christmas. I was out with a bunch of other journalists, mainly Brits and Americans. We were all part of this sort of same gang of friends, and many people had, you know, become too used to having to cancel events. And this rumour went round, but it was rumour 100, you know. And I remember that night, the calls coming in from across the dinner table.
Well, I remember because I was at NBC News at the same time you were at ITV, and I know that you kept being sent there when it was a sort of Mandela death watch. They'd say, oh, it looks like Mandela's going to die and Rohit's going, and then actually no, Rohit's coming back again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this went on for quite some time.
It felt like it was almost constant, and to the extent that you then sort of, you kind of divorce yourself from the possibility that that this is an event that will happen during the time that you're there. And in fact, one of the telling moments was actually that night, a conference call. We'd all gone out and had quite a lot of wine, and I remember a conference call being dialed through with a bunch of NBC executives and anchors. And they were taking the prospect far more seriously than I was. And so I remember saying, you know, one thing we had always been told about the way that events would work. And South Africa's government is quite chaotic. But we were always told that, you know, this is being done for the consumption of people in South Africa, as you would expect. You know, many of whom don't have electricity in rural areas in the evening. And so by the time we got to, you know, 9, 10 o'clock local time, you know, I was thinking, this won't be announced today. If anything, it'll be announced tomorrow. And I remember, you know, on this huge conference call with some of the most senior people in television news in the world, just saying, you know, slightly sort of patronizing, listen, guys, this isn't being done for the good of people in New York. This won't be announced for Eastern time. And then obviously 20 minutes later, it was...
Okay, well, look, you did cover it in the end. So can we just take a look at his work?
His widow looked broken, bewildered. Much of the world is mourning Nelson Mandela.
Long live the spirit of Nelson Mandela, long live.
But no one can be missing him as she does. If there is one woman who knows how she feels, it is his former wife, Winnie, who embraced her in the driving rain as today's service began. This was a day for hugs and for handshakes. President Obama and Raul Castro of Cuba. It seemed that even now Mandela was turning foes into friends. Who else could unite such a diversity of people? With guests that came from the slums of Soweto and the hills of Hollywood.
No, please tell us what you felt today.
The fellow revolutionary whose politics went a different way to Mandela's.
How are you feeling today?
Overwhelmed with sorrow.
Overwhelmed.
To the rock star who sang for Madiba's freedom.
Just tell me your thoughts.
Just thoughts with the family actually, and I'm very honoured to be asked to be here.
This was a service of music and prayer. It felt more like a carnival than a funeral, but at its heart were the Mandela grandchildren who read poems about the man they knew and didn't know when he was in jail.
Child of dreams of a future where black and white, rich and poor, men, women, and children must live side by side, dreaming the same dream, realizing at the crucible of time in our land. We salute you.
Without President Mandela, there would be no President Obama, America's first black leader, South Africa's last white leader, both affected by the politics of Mandela.
Over 30 years ago, while still a student, I learned of Nelson Mandela and the struggles taking place in this beautiful land, and it stirred something in me. It woke me up to my responsibilities, to others and to myself, and it set me on an improbable journey that finds me here today. And while I will always fall short of Madiba's example, he makes me want to be a better man. He speaks to what's best inside us.
Then, with David Cameron and the Danish Prime Minister, a souvenir photograph on this day for sorrow and for selfies. But what of the current South African president? Mandela's shadow has never seemed so large. The jeers are to say, "You are no Mandela," on a day when the hope of the past and disappointment of the present seem so far apart. This was a day to say farewell, but for Mandela's former lawyer, the goodbyes had already been said.
2 months ago, I did say goodbye to him after a half an hour's discussion. I was in shirt sleeves, having left my jacket in the car. And as I said goodbye, he said, "George, make sure that you don't leave your jacket behind." He was ill, but he knew what it was about.
Nelson Mandela!
Mandela's dream for South Africa is still a work in progress, even though the dreamer has now gone.
In many ways, we are here today to tell Madiba that his long walk is over, that he can finally rest, that he can enjoy the view of our beautiful country.
That was no comfort to Mandela's widow. To the sound of celebration, a look of pain, the father of the nation and of a family, honoured and mourned too. Rohit Kachroo, ITV News, Soweto.
What a wonderful obit. It was certainly worth the wait. Let's talk a little bit, just for a minute or so, about the life of a foreign correspondent. I've done this too, and being perfectly honest, I really struggled with it because of family life. My children were very young, and in the end, I felt I had to make a choice, which I did, and they obviously won. But tell me a little bit about what sort of challenges you faced.
You know, people think it's easy, and what's interesting is when you come back into the newsroom in London from a posting as a foreign correspondent, people think it's all about, you know, long lunches and playing sport all day and doing the occasional story. And perhaps it was at one point in time. It's a huge, huge privilege. It's probably one of the greatest privileges in TV news, really, because you're sort of the eyes and the ears of your viewers, spanning, a huge continent. I mean, 54 countries in Africa and, 2,000 languages spoken, and to cover that feels like an enormous privilege. You're also privileged because you have been sent somewhere interesting to live by your employer.
And you get to work on some of the world's biggest stories.
Absolutely. And you're if it happens on your patch, you're always the first person there. But I always felt that you have to repay that privilege to your employer. You have to work harder out there when you are working, and quite often, for long spells you're not. Part of that is financial. There's only so much money to cover the news any one year. And if every story you pitch involves getting on a plane and a lot of money's been spent somewhere else, then you're not going to be working as hard. But I felt a responsibility to sort of immerse myself in some of the biggest stories. In the Mandela story there, getting to know members of his family. The Oscar Pistorius story. Getting to know a lot of the key players there. And actually. Yes, it's a privilege, but there's a responsibility attached. But it's a fantastic, because to see the world, or to see a part of the world as extensively as you do, being Africa correspondent for ITV News is an enormous privilege.
Okay, well, look, let's talk about some of the other privileges, and that is a chance to speak to some really significant world leaders. Both good and bad ones. And let's talk about Robert Mugabe. Just before you tell me a bit about this interview and what happened, let's actually watch the interview you did.
Thank you.
I'm being shown around the presidential state house that Robert Mugabe might soon have to vacate.
But I listened to the piano. Yes, we had the piano for the kids.
It's the eve of a vote that will re-elect or unseat him. But whatever the results, he says the process will be free and fair.
There are fears internationally, not only about violence, but frequently about vote rigging as well.
That's a foreign word, rigging, here. We have never, ever rigged the election. This is not the first time we are voting. We started in 1980, 1985. Every 5 years, we have done elections.
And elections have never been rigged in Zimbabwe?
Never, ever. That I can assure you.
Robert Mugabe is campaigning for a victory that would end the loveless marriage of Zimbabwe's unity government. He says he'll accept the result, though his opponents aren't so sure. And he blames Britain for many of Zimbabwe's problems today.
Really a condemnation by us of Britain, and mainly of the government of Mr. Blair. He's the one who caused it. He didn't want dialogue, and then we wondered what sort of government it was that would prefer, to impose sanctions on us. If the British people would want us to be related to them once again, we are free, we are open. We never have taken a stance of hate.
Then to the matter of his age, 89 years old, but not a barrier to genuine victory, he says.
The end of a person's era is decided by the person himself. You say, now is my time to retire, I retire. Before he is able to do so, it doesn't matter what age he may be. Let him go the full strength. And here I am.
Is there a number one regret from your 33 years in charge of Zimbabwe?
No, really. No regret. I don't have regrets at all. None.
Today, Robert Mugabe tried to show us an open president embarking on an open process. But with hours until the polls open and with new claims of voter intimidation, there are the same old fears about how the coming days might unfold. Rohit Kachroo, ITV News, Harare.
Now, a really fun interview to do, right? How did you feel about doing it, before and after?
Well, a bit like our previous story about the death of Nelson Mandela, actually. It felt like quite a long process. And I'd been set the task by my boss of getting an interview with Robert Mugabe. And you know, I had flown up to Harare a couple of times to sort of talk to his people. And, you know, they were, as you would expect, very... you know, they enjoyed the fact that you were sort of chasing them for something. But, I mean, look, it's a huge honour, and it's sort of, the way it happened was I had been told that there was a chance of an interview. We went to a press conference where there were maybe, on the eve of the elections, there were maybe 100 journalists there, and then his press secretary comes out into the crowd and says, "Kachroo," and points at me, and I was sort of like, what? He says, "President will see you now." And so, which is slightly daunting. I mean, you're sort of like...
Were you prepped for that? Were you ready?
Well, I mean, in the back of my head, I knew there was a possibility, but, you know, you're sort of thinking, you know, chances are it won't
happen.
So I wasn't as prepped as I should have been or would have been. And frankly, looking back on it, you know, he doesn't really say anything that interesting in that interview, and that's my fault. But you know, on that case, the joy is, you know, what we call the get, you know, the getting of the interview in itself. Which
and I would disagree with you, because I think he said that the two things that were actually quite good. One about never, 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 ever, ever has there been rigging, and then no regrets. You know, you sort of almost didn't have to ask him anymore. He gave himself away.
I guess so. You know, what's really interesting though, being there, is you know, he's surrounded by his Secret Service, and you know that there's a point at which you get chucked out, that you probably get the cameras confiscated, and the whole thing was pointless. And so you're treading that balance of trying to hold him to account, but also you want to finish the interview. You know, you want your 15 minutes. And
you don't want to be barred from future press conferences.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, but just being in there is slightly discombobulating as well, because you're sort of in this kind of, like, so that was his home, the State House, and he's talking about the piano there. And I mean, that was an extensive conversation where he's saying to me, you know, I like playing the piano. And he says, "Do you play?" And I said, "Yeah, actually, I played as a kid." I'm thinking, 30 seconds in, I'm thinking, God, I'm standing here with Robert Mugabe talking about, like, my piano lessons from the age of 13. And actually, you know, if people are thinking of journalism as a career, as a general point, I mean, frankly, moments like that, moments like being with Bono and Naomi Campbell there on the day of Nelson Mandela's memorial service, that is moments like that are what actually make journalism. You know, it's interesting, the people I went to university with, those of us who are journalists aren't necessarily the best paid when we all get together, but actually, you know, the experiences that you live in journalism, in all bits of journalism.
Yeah, it's amazing life experience.
Particularly in TV news, it actually does you know, bring great joy.
Okay, so then you did 4 years in Africa, and then you came back to London. So tell me about that new role that you then...
Well, initially, as I said earlier, I came back to be what we called at the time UK editor, which was what other networks call Home Affairs editor or Home Affairs correspondent. I think previous bosses at ITV News decided that it was a sort of boring sounding name, and that UK editor was a sort of punchier title. And so we were covering, you know, lots of terrorism cases. And the reality...
What year was it?
Say again?
What year was it?
So I came back at the end of 2014.
Okay, so the rise of ISIS was happening.
The rise of ISIS, and there were lots of cases in the UK, but a few months later it dawned on everyone that actually this wasn't something that you could cover from within Home Affairs. It was a topic area in itself. And then so a year ago I started as security editor, which has been an incredibly interesting, fascinating brief.
Yeah, and one of the stories you covered was about schoolgirls. Can we take a look at that?
Yeah, sure.
About it in a moment.
It's 18 months since they left. First to Turkey, then to Syria. 3 heartbroken families were left behind. ITV News has followed their stories. We travelled to Istanbul to trace the girls' route.
I don't really recognise my sister, the video, the CCTV we saw, because this is just not her.
But ever since, they've been trying to get them back to London. Tonight, we reveal how one of the girls wanted to return and her family's extraordinary attempts to orchestrate it after making contact from their East London home.
Things have changed. The way she used to communicate with me, the way she used to talk about things has totally changed to what up until now she's scared of, being there.
Her sister is Khadija Sultana, who was 16 years old when she left.
And then she told me that she got a job.
This is the start of a chain of events, of emotional exchanges that will end in tragedy. Khadija has told them the man she married in Syria has been killed and she wants to come back. From Raqqa, she's arranged a conversation with her sister.
I don't have a good feeling, I feel scared.
What, you feel scared?
To do this. Yeah.
Why do you feel scared?
If something goes wrong, that's it.
I know what you mean.
I'll never be able to.
I understand what you mean, and it is, from where you are, I can understand that, you're feeling like that is not abnormal. But the only thing I would say to you is just trust us.
The borders are closed right now. So how am I going to get out? I'm not going to go through PKK territory to come out. I'm never going to do that ever.
They want her to leave in the back of a cab to get to a safe house.
Which side of the park is it on?
But first they have to establish her current location.
It's a square park, right? It's called Al-Baik. The spelling is A-L and Baik is B-A-I-K. But how confident are you, say, when things are put in place and you have to get on a cab? How confident are you feeling in terms of just that?
Zero. Where's Mom?
Mom's home.
No, I want to speak to her.
You can call anyone at Mum's. She sounds very terrified, and she did get very emotional there as well. It just feels, I really feel helpless, really, thinking, if I can just sit here, what can I do? It's really hard. I don't think she's ever made a choice by herself, has she?
No,
anything.
That was the first one.
That was the first one and a very big one. But she's actually never ever made a choice by herself. I kind of just look forward for the next call. And that's what keeps me going. Okay, I know Sunday she's going to contact me and that's it.
But there wouldn't be many more conversations like this. The family received a call to say Khadija had been killed in an airstrike. This can't be verified, but the calls home have now stopped. Today, their former lawyer said there should be lessons for anyone trying to travel to Syria.
It's most unfortunate that that this situation has arisen, and one would hope that the only benefit out of this is as a tombstone and a testament to others of these are the risks actually involved in going to a war zone, to dissuade people from ever making that choice, really.
But Khadija didn't travel alone, and we don't know the intentions or the fate of the other girls she travelled to Syria with.
This story, Rohit, doesn't it really typify how scarily small the world is? But it also strikes me as it was a perfect job for you after foreign reporting.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to do with this was actually to humanise, we saw in some of the previous reports that actually stories are most powerful when they hang around a character. And perhaps that's why the journey of these three girls from East London to Syria caught the imagination so much, because, people had perhaps become tired of seeing these stories of guys in their young 20s, late teens, who might have gone into gang life on the streets of West London or Luton or wherever else. Whereas these were girls, these were people I think emotionally interact with the stories of girls quite differently to stories of young boys. And we'd followed their stories and the stories of their families as well, because people always forget the people left behind, who are thinking, well, did I do something wrong? Did I screw up as a parent or as a sibling or as a cousin or whatever? And in doing this job, one of the aims of me and the team that I work with has been to put a human face on so many of these issues. We're constantly being handed, reports from the Home Affairs Select Committee or, freedom of information figures, and, reports and figures are fine, but to convert them into stories, human faces such as hers allow us to do that.
Rohit, there are so many other questions I could ask you, but I do want to spend a little bit of time giving everybody in the audience a chance to ask you questions too. But my very last question to you, there's no denying the fact that both of us are sitting up here as non-white journalists who've had long careers in this business. What does that mean to you?
Well, it's interesting, and it's a debate that is actually in the news quite a lot at the moment, because high-profile people are talking about it. And we're not talking just about race, but also about gender as well. I mean, there's a lot of work from City University about male and female balance on television programs, and I think we all have two responsibilities really in TV. One is to sort of represent the voice of our own background. And perhaps there aren't enough people of ethnic minorities, but also females in television news. But also, you've got to kind of speak for the whole country as well. So I'm always reluctant to sort of just be sort of sectioned off into one corner of like the news spectrum. But there's a lot more to it. I mean, I feel quite strongly that actually diversity, true diversity, the surface diversity, race, gender, but true diversity actually means, hearing from voices outside of London, in the north of England, Brexit revealed, and actually the election of Donald Trump in the States, all the US media are now looking at themselves and saying, have we become too metropolitan? Are we only about the East Coast and the West Coast? Have we ignored Middle America? And they're all fair questions for all of us in the UK as well to ask about our own media coverage.
And also you and I were talking backstage about the importance of mentoring and offering ourselves up as mentors or possible mentors. Anyway, let me get some questions from the audience. There are some microphones going around. So if you've got a question here at the front. Is there a microphone just down here, right at the front, in the front row? Thank you.
I'd like to ask two quick questions, if that's okay. Yeah. I'm studying journalism at university. I've just started my third year. I asked this question to someone before, and I was wanting to get what your opinion, what your answer on it would be. The first one is what would like a recommended way to get into the field? Is there any advice for someone like me who's like a trainee journalist sort of thing? And you mentioned at the start about you were really persistent in writing to organisations and things to get things. Would you say that persistence is key into to start getting in? To
get into the field, as in literally
and to get into journalism and to get jobs and stuff.
Okay. Well, I mean, as I think we touched on earlier, I would say there is no one route and there's no correct answer. And actually, people coming into it now, your generation, perhaps more so than mine, actually have a multitude of options. I mean, when I left university, there was no BuzzFeed. I mean, you know, Netflix weren't commissioning programs. I mean, this was not, the world is changing. And actually, one of the strengths that you have is your understanding of the changing world. I mean, the people who are my bosses and bosses across the industry could probably never claim to have the same grasp on, you know, the evolution of TV, you know, online, you know, all the, you know, new platforms, social media platforms that you can of your generation. So if I were in your position, I would be somehow trying to utilize that. But, you know, I think persistence is a key characteristic of for any journalist, you know, particularly if you want to be a correspondent. I think you just need to just push and push and push. But you also need, you know, and this is what people talk about far less, is sort of emotional intelligence. I mean, no one ever tells you that you need emotional intelligence as a journalist. So you also need to know where the line is, where you're actually just becoming a bit irritating, you know, and just sort of being half a step before that line, I would say, is the best place to be.
Thank you. And also, find a great story and be the only
Absolutely.
one who's got access to that story, and go in at a very junior level.
Absolutely, because that's a unit. You know, people talk about changing platforms, changing media, but what's universal is the value of a brilliant story. And if you can, you know, you can do all the editing courses that you like, but one brilliant story trumps all of that. You know, if you go to a newsroom with a great story that they will want to put at the top of their program, or frankly anywhere on their program, I mean, you are now the most valuable person to that newsroom, the most valuable person in your position, and that you know, people when I was at Cardiff, I mean, we were constantly being told about editing courses. And look, it's a great course, but people were less keen to tell you about the value of actually coming in with a piece of original journalism. And I would say that there is so much information out there that the value of original journalism has never been so great.
Great, thank you. And be prepared to take all kinds of roles with, you know, the researcher, the broadcast assistant, the producer, before you maybe become a reporter. Okay, any other questions? One at the back there.
My question to you is very simple, sir. When you're reporting in terms of security and defense-like issues, what is the possibility of a journalist to sound jingoist? Because I have seen a lot of journalists when they are in the course of reporting, you know, issues related to defense and security, they kind of, you know, cross the line of journalism at times, I feel. So did you had any experience like that when you're reporting and something like that?
You see it a fair bit. You see it more in the print media than you do on TV. But yeah, I mean, I think that is a danger. That is a danger. And because we're talking specifically about, particularly on counter-terrorism, we're talking a lot about certain communities. And so it requires this sort of constant sense, firstly, of how your words will be interpreted. But also, I think that constant sense of nuance in everything you say. I mean, the front page of the Daily Mail will often tell you that someone is the worst threat to the UK, national security, hatred, blah, blah, blah. But I think our view in broadcasting is to see things a little more from both sides, but also to apply things universally. I mean, so for example, I mean, there's a sort of a thing that goes around Twitter every time that a white person is accused of a terrorist offence, and it's a sort of skin colour chart which says, you know, mentally ill there for that colour, terrorist for this colour, and that's somewhere in the back of our minds as well. I mean, you know, a terrorist doesn't look a certain way. They don't have a certain skin colour. They're not a certain age. And actually, I think the most useful thing that we can do covering this topic area is just be completely universal and to just take two steps back. Like every time we feel that actually, are we slipping into a trap here? Is there, you know, are we being tempted to say something about someone because they are of a certain religion or because they look a certain way. And I'm pretty confident that in the time that I've been doing this job that we have, I don't think there's an example that anyone could accuse us of having done that in the last 12 months.
Yeah, and that constant self-examination you're doing is
Absolutely,
really
yeah.
important. Okay, we've probably got an opportunity to get 2 more questions in, so any more questions in the audience? Yeah, okay, at the back.
So do you have to be cautious of the jobs that you take in the beginning of your career when you're thinking about your end goal? If so, how do you choose?
That's a really tricky. There's no right answer, no wrong answer. I mean, when I have taken jobs, I have never done it with a sort of big end goal in mind. I think, you know, if you're lucky enough to be offered a job that you want to do, you know, if you want to be a journalist and someone offers you a great job doing journalism, then you're kind of already in the top 10% of society of people who are like, you know, doing something that they want to do. So, you know, there's probably a danger in being too strategic about things because the world changes. You know, companies that exist today might not exist in 5 years. The biggest player then might be someone you've never heard of now. So I think in the world we're in, which is changing so quickly, it's probably a danger in being a bit too strategic. But you know, if someone offers you a job and it's a great job and you want to be a journalist, I mean, you know, there aren't many of those jobs. So you know, I suspect that the advice will probably nearly always be take it.
And the industry has evolved so much, you know, in such unpredictable ways. I think if you just get a chance to tell stories and get a job in the industry, that's a really great starting point.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question. Who wants to have the final word? Yes, over here.
Hi, I just wondered, after spending so many years covering such hard stories, do you ever feel like you get a sense of like a loss of innocence of the world and you see things differently than you did before you started?
No, it's a simple answer because in a sense it almost goes the other way because when you're seeing the world through a television news bulletin, it's a pretty scary world. When you go out and see it close up, it's nearly always less frightening, less horrific. You know, we went to cover a few civil wars in Africa, and actually, when I look back at those stories, what's striking is that the sense of fear that you get viewing it now is far greater than the sense of fear that you had at the time. You know, because you're actually not filming, you know, the people normally just going around doing their shopping in the street. And so actually the world close up, I would say, you know, others might disagree, I would say is less frightening a lot of the time than it is sitting in your living room in the UK.
What a wonderful existential question.
Yeah, really good question.
And what a hopeful
really
answer. I would slightly disagree with you, but you know, really hopeful answer.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rohit. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. It's been amazing. I have a very, very final, very quick question. Where do you see your career going? What would you really like to do next?
I mean, going back to the question over there, I mean, I don't know. It's sort of, I think if you're doing a job you enjoy and you feel it's an important job, I mean, it's probably a bit presumptuous to think about the next one. So, I mean, it's a really boring answer.
Open to opportunities. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, and thanks for your wonderful questions.